Yo, how are you doing, folks? Welcome to episode 106 of the Simpa Life Podcast. I hope you are having a wonderful January. We're starting to move towards, I suppose, what the pagans called, was it Imbolc? The equal point between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. So we are getting brighter. Things are getting warmer. I don't know if you've noticed out there, for all it is a little bit miserable weather-wise, it is still bright. Although I don't know what time it is when you're watching this. So this is irrelevant information to you folks. All I'm saying is that the weather is getting good. It's getting nice. Let's get optimistic. Let's get hopeful. So today's guest, I'm hoping, is going to do that because we're going to have a nice, wonderful conversation and oversight of drug policy, what has been going on for the past few decades and what is currently going on at a time of, quite contention, I suppose, controversy in some ways. Let's provide critical insight and comment on the state of play in the UK with today's guest, who is the Executive Director of Release, where for over 2 decades she has worked to reform drug policy here in the UK. In that time, she has co-authored several papers and presented at many conferences, both nationally and internationally, and is regularly provides comment to the media in matters pertaining to drugs. They are Niamh Eastwood. How are you doing?
I am very well. And just to say, it's Niamh Eastwood.
Niamh. Oh.
Sorry, difficult Irish one. Not so difficult, but Niamh.
Niamh. Okay, I'll try and correct that every time in my head when I go to say that. Thank you for calling me on that, because honestly, my name is Simpa. I get called Simba God knows how many times a day. So I understand what it is to have a pet peeve about having your name incorrectly pronounced.
Yeah, no, especially for a full podcast, that would be too much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, be an awkward old hour and a bit here, wouldn't it? So I suppose for people that don't know yourself, there will be from my listeners and audience out there, if you've seen me at an event, you will have been given one of these. I have given out thousands of these things in the past, 8-9 years. Oh, look, Durham police sticker just stuck out. And so obviously Released, you guys, I suppose, along with Transform, you are the pillars of the reform institutions here in the UK. So could you sort of give people a bit of an insight as to Release and what you guys do?
Yeah, of course. Firstly, thank you so much for giving out the cards. That's wonderful to hear. And if you need more, just let me know. So we are the UK's Centre of Expertise on Drugs and Drug Laws. And what that means on a kind of day-to-day basis is that we provide legal services to people who are impacted by the drug laws. So that's both people who use drugs and people who are over-policed because of the current framework that we have to operate in. And we also provide legal services in the community to people who have experience with drug dependency. So mainly those who have a history of heroin and crack cocaine use, alcohol dependence, and really sort of addressing the issues of poverty and how poverty in and of itself can contribute to problematic drug use. It's a kind of rational reaction sometimes to the trauma that living in those circumstances can create. So we address things like homelessness, housing, debt issues, access to welfare benefits, and we support about 1,000 people a year through that outreach work. We also have a drugs helpline where we provide advocacy for people who are in treatment, and really make sure that their rights within the treatment system are realised. And that can be everything from making sure people are on the right dose of OST to helping people get medical cannabis prescriptions. We've done 1 or 2 of those. It's not the mainstay of our work, but we have done a couple of those. And I should say it's the private prescriptions, not the NHS. And then we also do a lot of policy work. So we kind of highlight what the damages are of drug policy within the UK context, looking at the impact of policing on Black communities and people who live in areas of deprivation. And we also look to solutions that are founded in principles of racial and social justice framing. So very much looking at decriminalization, removing the criminality, removing the idea of punishment for drug use. So not just replacing it with civil sanctions, but actually going for a no punishment model that allows people to use drugs. And that's all drugs. And more recently, we've done a paper on cannabis regulation and calling for a social equity approach to cannabis regulation within the UK. And I'm guessing we'll get into the weeds of that in this conversation.
Nice pun. I like it. Yeah, very succinct, very concise for what you guys do sort of as an organization. I suppose then let's get on to your personal journey as to what kind of led you to release. You, from what I've seen, come from sort of the legal profession prior to sort of drug reform.
Yeah.
Are you one of these kind of what's the word, the almost the cliche of prohibitionist to reformer,
God
or
no, God no. I was so the honest story is that I'd finished my law degree, I'd done the bar course, I was desperate to work in a charity in kind of human rights law, that kind of thing, and release came along, and I myself had taken drugs, had continued to take drugs at that time, so I was a teenager in the 90s, in Northern Ireland. It all was very popular back then. And so I was very much aware of the impact of criminalization and how it could harm people and harm their life chances. And I also was, I suppose growing up in Northern Ireland, very aware of kind of the use of police as a form of oppressing people. And obviously the context is different in Northern Ireland, but I could see within my experience of going to university in London that the drug laws were being used particularly to target certain folks within the city. And so I had that kind of idea of wanting to ensure that we moved towards policies that really focused on a rights-based approach. And so it was my first kind of job in that sector. I had come from teaching law and, as I said, doing my bar course. And I was a part-time legal advisor. Release was almost bust back then. I mean, we were about to go into administration basically when I started. I went out and did 3 legal surgeries a week in parts of London, seeing folks who got a history of drug dependency. As I say, I mean, heroin and crack cocaine mainly. And I loved my clients. They were fab, and they continue to be fab. The system is really what's wrong, and how the system treats them, and that level of inequality, and also the idea of people who use drugs. And this, I think, is particularly pertinent for the people who use those types of drugs, but it applies to cannabis use as well. But so often the idea of the other in society plays into that, and how people who use drugs are often the guinea pigs for really draconian laws that come along. So whether that be kind of antisocial behavior legislation, like if we think the first closure order legislation pertained to heroin and crack users, or if it's around like drug, all the different laws that we see kind of coming along and that are really oppressive, and that our folks, so the folks that it's tested out on in the first place. And we fight against that, obviously, but it is a sort of, I suppose, a Herculean task to try and convince the system that the people, so the system sees the people as the problem, where actually it's the system that's the problem. And I think I really like the idea of working in that space. So the clients I fell in love with, and then as I developed at Release, I got more involved in policy. And I would say now, as a director, I am no longer qualified to do the legal work, because you really have to, the law changes so often that you have to stay on top of that, especially the areas of law that we work on in the community, so the homelessness and the welfare benefits, etc. And so I've moved in more to the policy and the kind of leadership roles, and the policy work. Like I adore that. I love the opportunity to really expose the kind of the cruelty and the immorality of our of drug prohibition.
Nice. So yeah, so this is very much a lifelong kind of project. You've always felt this kind of injustice, and I think, yeah, growing up in the 90s in Northern Ireland, I mean, you guys had quite a good free party scene, same as a lot of the North did, Scotland did, Wales did, basically anything get away from London, really. I mean, not the diss London scene. London had a scene. I'm not saying that's what I'm saying, but it was different. It was so community focused. It was so driven by the minority of people that I'd self-identified or were noted to be the weirdos, the outcasts, and shunned. And together we found community, we found solidarity in the face of, well, in the case of Northern Ireland, still an ongoing conflict. Well, potentially one that can be reignited by Brexit, but that's a whole different fucking conversation.
Totally. But you make a really great point, like the cross community scene in kind of the mid 90s or the early 90s. And the influence of the North in Northern Ireland, so lots of folks who had gone to live in Manchester and places like that coming back, and MDMA and the summer of love all over again. And it was one of the best things for cross-community relations. I mean, I often say that I think that that's one of the things that really kind of broke down some of the barriers that existed between communities. This idea of people dating cross-community, that kind of thing, became much more apparent, I think, in the 90s, and the summer of love and all of the various scenes around that contributed to it. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's interesting, as you said before, about drug users or consumers being the prototype communities. So I think of I don't know what it is in Northern Ireland or whether it's applicable in Northern Ireland, but I think in England and Wales, we have the 1994 Public Order, basically the Free Party Act. And it basically, when any more than 13 people with music that goes dum, 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 dum is banned. And the reason there was the dum, dum, dum was banned was so that posh people could still have their garden parties. You could still have Cheltenham and all the rest of it. And it was, again, just such a focused, laser-focused kind of classist cultural attack against this cross-cohesion, this emergence of, again, as you say, people getting together and going, wait, so we have everything in common, except I'm told to hate you because of that line that neither of us can see. Do you know what I mean? And it erodes that. And I think you see these kind of fluctuations. And I think I grew up in probably the third wave of rave. I'm 34. So my late teens, we again had a huge renaissance of drug policy, thanks in part to people like Gordon Brown and that pissing around with the cannabis CB whole thing of classification and creating this space where people could just kind of go, well, we're Amsterdam now, whatever. And it just kind of brought this renaissance. And then again, our culture and community was attacked. And now we have obviously Theresa May in 2017, novel psychoactive bill, and the way that they again continue to come at us. We're now seeing obviously very openly in the past 2 years, people like Suella Braverman and Priti Patel now attack organized protest. So we're now at a point that was our protest. We got together in a field, 50, 100 people from all colors, all creeds, all backgrounds, sexualities, and identities. And we just danced until our shoes were gone, till we were sinking in the mud, and we were together. They criminalized and attacked that. And there's been this constant back and forth. So one of the things I wanted to, obviously, you've recently passed, I suppose, your second decade in this. I wanted to get your opinion on how things have changed since then. In terms of the policy and the culture and
yeah, it has. I mean, it's been a journey. You mentioned transform, and you mean obviously as organizations we worked up really closely together. Like Steve Rolls and I grew up in this space together, from sort of youngsters who were idealistic and wanted to change the world. And I think, speaking from my perspective, and I think probably Steve would agree with this to some degree, is like in the first decade, it was, so this is the noughties, and Labour government, and again all of those moves towards laws that control folks through antisocial behaviour, but then also to the cannabis classification nonsense. And I think at that time it was seen much more of a kind of left field issue than it is now. I think the public weren't that interested. I think that there was probably not the scale of knowledge that existed around the harms of drug policy, not just to people who use drugs, but also to people who are over-policed because of the drug laws. And in particular, cannabis laws. We have to recognize that those are the big drivers. Cannabis stop and search is the big driver for over-policing in our communities across the country. The arrival of kind of bodies such as the Global Commission on Drug Policy, where you had ex-presidents coming out and saying the war on drugs has failed. And these were ex-presidents from countries which were arguably sort of ground zero for the war on drugs. I think that actually was a big difference in terms of the dialogue and the environment that we've worked in. And I think, our organization, Transform, and others have really contributed to that body of work that legitimized the space and allowed for a much more broader involvement of different political parties who are interested in reform. The fact now is Labour and the Conservative Party are the only two parties that aren't actually committed to reform of some sort. And we'll get there with them. But the fact that they both have representation within their parties around drug policy reform now is a real sign of the progress that's been made. It may not feel like progress when you've got things like the white paper that talks about seizing passports, etc. But there is a large body of opposition to those kind of proposals and a large critique of statements such as cannabis should be a Class A drug, which we heard from the Home Secretary. I think, and the speed of response to that. So like the white paper, and I think probably your listeners will already know about this, but the proposals from the Home Office to essentially expand policing of drugs because they want to target so-called middle class drug users. But we know that in fact, this will target the same people who have been historically targeted, and brings in a whole raft of possible draconian responses when someone has been caught on a third occasion for possession of drugs, including removal of, driving license, passports, banning orders, preventing people from entering nightclubs, all of these different really harsh responses. The fact that we were so easily able to get 500 experts from across the globe and within the UK to sign up to a letter saying this is an unevidenced and dangerous approach to drugs that will cause more harm than good, and get that on the front page of the Telegraph. I think that's a sign that, this is a debate that is much wider in terms of the public interest, in terms of media interest. And I think also too, the fact that we're seeing such fast changes in drug policy in other countries across the globe, again, especially with cannabis regulation, will inevitably impact on the UK. So I think we're at a tipping point. I think it's a much more positive space than, say, 20 years ago to be in from a policy perspective. It doesn't feel like that every day when you're having to write long submissions against these white papers. But I think, we're getting there. We're building the evidence. We've got the real life examples of models across the world, whether that be regulation or decriminalization of all drugs. Times are changing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was kind of a large and very difficult question to ask. 20 years has happened, tell us everything. But I think, that was pretty good. I think the main point to kind of take away is one of the things that I always try to remind myself of when I get frustrated by this, and that is there is at least politicians listening. Even if some of it is still lip service and there is still I'm not going to name drop who they are and get them in trouble, but we've had at least one MP on the podcast previously, and what they said on the podcast and what they said privately was potentially maybe slightly different. And I understand the reasons for this, the acceptability of it, the need to continue in their position. But yeah, the fact that we have these kind of conversations, we have for all frustrated and not very happy with them as an organization, we have a conservative drug policy reform group. We have a Labour policy drug reform group. Don't necessarily look at their arrangements and the fact that they're in the same building, etc., and what that says towards neoliberalistic intentions or whatever. But yeah, it's interesting. The other sort of parties, I just Googled there to check what the term was, the Overton window, the kind of politically accepted. And we're in this really niched binary left-right neoliberalistic political paradigm. You can either be left ear, right ear. And it's like, well, actually, most politics falls outside of this now because that window is narrowed. Obviously, we've had certain international events that have happened recently that I think is kind of skewed with the traditional left-right binary codifying of individuals, political opinions. But yeah, it's how then do you reach them? Because one of the things that you've sort of done quite recently, or that I saw quite recently, was this white paper titled "A Quiet Revolution." A policy paper that you wrote, co-authored, "A Quiet Revolution: Drug Decriminalization Policies in Practice Across the Globe." And what we're seeing with that is it's not necessarily politicians that are decriminalizing; it's the police forces are de facto decriminalizing, deprioritizing, as we saw up here in Durham, sort of drug possession and consumption.
Well, what's interesting from that paper, and we did the first iteration of that paper in 2012. So it was one of the first policy pieces that I did as executive director. And what we really wanted to demonstrate at the time was Portugal wasn't the only country that had decriminalized. And in fact, what we look at in the policy paper are countries and states, US states and Australian states, that have decriminalized. And bar one example, it is all done either through statutory law or it's done through constitutional court decisions. So either politicians have legislated for decriminalization, and so it's a blanket approach across that jurisdiction, or the constitutional court, the highest court in the land, has said that the criminal law is a contrary to privacy rights. That tends to be the main argument. And so therefore the use of criminal law to try and deal with private personal use of drugs, or even in some cases, private social supply of drugs, is contrary to the Constitution. And so in that case, it's kind of, there's problems with the implementation. So we do not say this is the answer to everything, because there is no one kind of single approach to decriminalization. Some of them are very bad, some of them are okay. But it is at a state level, it's at a national level or a state level, and it is supposed to be implemented equally across the board. I think the problem with diversion schemes, and we don't include those in the paper, and if anyone's interested in it, we run a website called Talking Drugs, which is a multimedia website that's in several languages, and it updates regularly on developments across the globe that are in around drug policy or harm reduction. And one of the tools that we have on the website is a map of the world that is interactive, that can show you the different models of decriminalization. And as I said, they apply in different ways. But I think what we wanted to do was start a conversation that this isn't just Portugal. Portugal's really well researched, but it's not just Portugal. There's now 30 jurisdictions across the globe that have adopted this approach. When we first did the paper back in 2012, it was 21 jurisdictions from memory. So now it's up to almost over 30. This isn't cannabis regulation. This is decriminalization. So it's just the removal of criminal sanctions, either for possession or, in Spain's case, social supply as well. And in many cases, cultivation of cannabis. Most of the countries that have adopted the approach actually apply it to all drugs, not just to cannabis. When we look at the US states and Australian states, it tends to just be cannabis. So I think there's a lot of learning from it that shows us the different models and how they can operate in practice. I think there's a lot of learning as well within the field from analyzing these different models to allow us to start to think about, well, what's the framework we would want to see? And there was a group of experts who came together probably in 2018 in New York, and I was lucky enough to be at that meeting. And we talked about, well, what kind of model of decrim would we want? And we agreed no punishment. So there shouldn't be a punishment for being in possession of drugs. And too often with diversion schemes or with decrim models, there is a punishment. It's a shift from the criminal to the civil. There's no criminal record, which is really positive, and because we know the damage that that can do. But it's not enough. The state is still involved, and it doesn't relieve the pressure for those folks who've been over-policed as a result of the drug laws, who aren't always people who use drugs. So one of the things we've said is no punishment. And another thing is that we need to start looking at things like expunging records. So if someone has been historically criminalized for possession of drugs, why should they continue to carry the burden of a criminal record when people who are now caught in possession don't get that response? So I think there's a lot of positives around that kind of research for thinking about, like, what do we advocate for? And so across the drug policy field, whether it's us, Transform, the International Drug Policy Consortium, all of us say the gold standard is a no punishment model. So yeah, that research actually has gone on to be cited by numerous UN agencies. Release is seen as one of the experts globally on decriminalization. We've advised the Ghanaian government, the Icelandic government. We've been in US state hearings around decriminalization. So, I mean, it gives, just done a submission to the Australian government on the topic as well. So it gives us an opportunity to have a voice in that space and start to push that agenda of a no punishment model.
Which should be a given. I think a bit across the board. It frustrates me. I mean, here in the UK, we have well, not just here in the UK, across the world, we have drug snobbery and drug exceptionalism. Oh, my drug is fine. Your drug, however, is bad and devilish. You know, it's dangerous and it's going to ruin your life and whatever. We're such hypocrites when it comes to it. So it's good that, yeah, we're seeing this kind of movement around the world. As you say, there is this gradual, it's a marked acceleration, I would say, if you were to look at it on a graph over time. There does seem to be this co-option. So a topic and a subject that I have near and dear to my heart is this deep-seated fear that legalization is prohibition 2.0. This is why I fight for legalization has to include decriminalization. If you have
Absolutely.
a system where there is legal supply and people can be punished for having it in the wrong part of their car or too much of it, then you fucked up. There's something seriously wrong.
Totally.
But then the issue with just the decrim side of things is there's certain drugs, say cannabis, it's cool. Get some seeds, get some lights. Boom. If you're living near the equator, you live somewhere warm, it'll go outside, lovely, fine, safe. If you're then a heroin user, a little bit more difficult. You can grow poppies. You could obviously make the poppy to then refine it into a quality of something that you would want and use yourself. If you were to be caught with that, that's high level production, even if it was for self-sufficiency. So there are certain drugs and there are certain points of access that require more than the individual. And I look at Transform, have obviously done a great deal of work around theoretical models of cocaine supply, heroin supply, etc., of how this would be regulated and sold, etc., in an open market. But how do we kind of bridge that gap in between? Because if we can get the political masses to accept, even if it is just paying lip service and getting another 4 or 5 years for them in office, they allow this, all right, we'll decriminalize, and they create this classist, racist system that's still in operation. How do we have this next movement of collectivism under especially this UK paradigm where, I mean, technically, I could be abducted under sort of Braverman's fucking laws because I've attended a protest in the past 2 years. So if there's a protest in Newcastle, the police can come and just abduct me for the afternoon. You know what I mean? And then whatever they find in my house when they've, as far as I'm concerned, against my right to legally enter my home, I would then be charged with. Yeah. And it's farcical. So then you can see it's difficult for us to not just go, all right, we'll accept it. All right, I can carry one. All right, I'll carry one. But then there's still going to be the risk. The people that use drugs when it was illegal and you face the death penalty in countries are still going to break the laws, even if it's a fine or whatever later on down the line. It's not a deterrent. So how do we kind of provide that data and that real world evidence that we can be trusted as adults to go, well, actually, if the 20 of us want really good quality heroin, we're not going to spite each other or whatever. We can buy into a syndicate and do in the same way that people do with all sorts of other goods.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think there's so much to unpick from what you just said, Simpa. But so a couple of things on that. I mean, I think from an advocacy point of view, I mean, I constantly say decriminalization is not an opposition of legalization. They are complementary policies and both should actually be advocated together. That's what we should do. I think our organization has focused on decriminalization historically because we are also acutely aware, as you say, that politicians are not going to be minded to regulate heroin or crack cocaine or cocaine for recreational use at any time soon. That's not going to happen. So what we want to do is have an equitable approach about advocating for a policy that relieves some of the harms for people who use drugs in the interim. So it's kind of a harm reduction approach in terms of policy reform. On top of that, I think there's also, I'm really interested in what we have done in the field. And I think, again, we have become much better in recent years about our language in this and the idea of the user versus the supplier. So I won't use the word like dealer because I think, supply is a act of goodness in many cases. That's not all. We know there are violence in the market with certain actors. I would also argue there is violence in legal markets with certain actors as well. This is part of what, as you've said, capitalism. It thrives in that sense. But coming back to that kind of binary idea of the user and the supplier and really trying to break that down and recognizing anyone who uses drugs supplies drugs in some way. That's just, it's like kind of impossible not to, and particularly during COVID, we saw that kindness of people making sure others were okay, even your local supplier, making sure that you could get it on tick if you didn't have access to funds, and not in an exploitative way, in a recognition that funds dried up for a lot of folks who would get, money from things like begging, etc. So I think part of it is language, that we need to focus on language in order to change perceptions over time. On the regulatory side of things, again, I agree with you on Prohibition 2.0. I have deep concerns about that. And again, I know that friends of mine in the sector also have concerns about that. I think if we look at Canada, for example, the fact that Canada retained a criminal offence for simple possession of cannabis that is purchased outside of the legal market. Thankfully, what we've seen in practice is a deprioritization of policing. So they haven't gone after it, but retaining that on the statute books means that police can stop and search folks. They can arrest folks. How they actually police it, I don't know, but the fact that that's there concerns me. I think that is a continuation of criminalization. Also in Canada, the fact that we see such control of the markets by corporates, that the opportunity to enter that market is very, very hard. So we've done, as I said in the intro, a paper on cannabis regulation, looking at social equity principles, which is called Repairing the Wrongs, Regulating Right, and is available on our website. And basically what we do is we go through all of those things that you've talked about in terms of concerns of market control and prohibition, and looking at some of the emerging markets in the US states, which I think were a real surprise to all of us. I think we expected the US to be kind of ground zero for the hyper commercialized models. And yes, in some states that has happened, but in some states we've seen some of the most progressive economic models for cannabis that we've seen for any commodity in years. New York, for example, ensuring, like New York State had 2 pieces of legislation that would have legalized cannabis prior to the legalization that was adopted last year, isn't it? Sorry, 2 years ago, 2021.
Well, yeah,
yeah, and time folds in on itself now, doesn't it? So yeah, I mean, they had 2 potential opportunities to legalize cannabis, and the activists there went, nah, we're not having it. And you could see how quickly in the UK it could fall, like people going, well, it's better than nothing. At least we won't be criminalized. And it's like, no, but you don't understand. One, the cannabis might not be very good. So there's a personal interest in making sure that it works. And also to, folks who've been involved in the illicit market or whatever you want to call it for years are the people who have the expertise. For many, for them, it puts, food on the table, shoes on their kids' feet. And what do they do when corporates take over? So that learning from the US, I think, is a real opportunity and a real inspiration to our work around how do we as movements and as a movement coalesce together to say these are our red lines. And our paper that we launched last January is part of that. It's part of saying these are our red lines. We recognize that we are not corporates. We will not have the money that they have to lobby to do all of that work. But as a sector, so as third sector organizations, as people who are experts in this through lived and living experience, these are our red lines. We want to see a fair and equitable market, a market that decriminalizes possession outside of it, that provides licenses to people who have been historically involved in the market, for people who've been criminalized because of our previous cannabis laws. We want to see taxes given to communities that have been over-policed and over-criminalized. We want to see technical and financial assistance given to those who want to participate, because now you're going to have to be filling in lots of tax forms and doing all of that regulatory stuff, making sure we're skilling people up. So all of these different principles are what we are now advocating for, and we're asking folks to come together with us and say, we back this. This is what we want to see. I don't know if that answers your question. That feels like I went off on a tangent.
I think it covers it, and it opens up a whole bunch of points to query there. I agree. Canada's system especially the fact that for the first however many months, I mean, year plus even, of the government monopoly and regulation acting as a broker, the vested interests of some individuals. I mean, you had former heads of the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, suddenly inherit multi-million-pound cannabis contracts, and it was all just so disturbingly corrupt. And yeah, they're kind of reforming it now, and they've got kind of like the farm to table, as Remo, one of my previous guests, spoke of, and they've reformed a few bits here and there. But as you say, the nuance of where they've kept criminalization is it's a bastardization of the language. Because again, and I agree with you, I was very quietly cheering when you were on about language. I have been bullied, berated, and pretty close to being beaten for my stance on, the urgency, the need for a universal language in all of this. Because especially within the cannabis space, it is being weaponized and it is being co-opted to be marketing and advertising gimmicks. And we saw this first come out of Canada, really did it wonderfully. And you saw this collapse of the so-called medicinal sector, and the record, all that mattered for the producer is, where do we get the most money? That's what we'll call ourselves. That's what we'll do. And they're monopolized and conglomerated to a point where, as you said, the small guy couldn't get in. And then they're still raiding the small dispensaries. I mean, you think of the Emerys, Jody and Mark, and the work that they did in cannabis culture and others, and they've basically been banned from the country's system. You know, they were all but destroyed for their work. Yet they set that foundation. So yeah, the criminalization of children still occurs for cannabis possession, which is baffling. The point of this is to not ruin lives. Whose lives do you ruin for? Oh, let's still get for the children. Yeah, if you're 18, but yeah, you're wrong age, so we're gonna fuck you over. As you say, the wrong possession I've heard of from folks in Canada that are getting charged because this container wasn't sealed correctly.
Yeah.
It's not, they haven't written the laws yet for how it should be properly transported in a car, but then a loose interpretation from a corrupt judge and a corrupt cop, you could end up imprisoned.
I mean, the fact that Canada has more criminal laws now in relation to cannabis than it did prior to the introduction of legalization is absolutely astounding.
Yeah, I think it went from 7 to 43 or
That's
45,
right.
something
That's exactly
like that.
Right. Yeah.
And it was just like, that's what legalization looks like.
And that's legalization that protects corporates. And as I said, in practice, it's great that we've seen a deprioritization of policing. But again, like colleagues of ours in Canada would say that it's really important to bake in, and again, excuse the fun, but it is true, to bake in the social equity ingredients at the start, because trying to do it post the introduction of legalization is almost impossible. So they don't have expungement of records either. So that's not on it. So they're now having to legalize for that, and it's turned into a nightmare.
Yeah, they're really fucked up. So they did this because obviously America's system of the states had devolved power from the federal level. In Canada as well, there's 7, I always mix it up with Australia, I think 9 regions, and they have a loose autonomy. And as far as I remember it, this was 2018 when I went through this and was beating my stick about it. Yeah, they left it down to the interpretation of the states, and they said federally, yeah, we're going to expunge it, but because of the way that it would be implemented, the states are the ones that implement it. So I think when I wrote about this last year, out of a suspected 250,000 people, there was like 660 people, and they would be in charge like $600-700 for the privilege as well. So it was like, fuck off. But
whereas Massachusetts and New York have done really good work to kind of think about how do we, and it's not perfect, and every state seems to learn a little bit more from the one that went before. So like New York, I'll harp on about New York because it is the most ambitious to date, but New York has made sure that smoking of cannabis in a public space isn't a criminal offense, because they saw that that was continuing to be used. And and this comes back to the racial disparities that we see in drugs policing and what the purpose of drugs policing is. Like, I'm a big believer that drugs policing is not about the drugs, it's about social control. We just need to look at who is profiled under this to evidence that. And so therefore, any leakage that we have in reform that allows for that to continue will continue to be perpetrated against the people who have been historically affected by prohibition. So I think it's really important, and it's so exciting to learn from the US. Like, I just did not imagine that, but we are where we are, and it's such a pleasure to be able to work with colleagues there and think about how do we make sure that when we get to that state in the UK, which we will, that we're prepared to argue out each of those areas.
Yeah, exactly. And you're entirely correct. We're now what, year 13 in this experiment. I suppose it was late 2012 when they were voted. Obviously, it was 2014 when Colorado and Washington finally came on board with dispensaries, but they allowed gifting economies. They allowed, you'd buy a lighter and, that lighter is $25 and that lighter was attached to an eighth. But you see, you didn't buy the eighth sort of thing. So they worked around it, and that was kind of allowed. Again, I agree with New York. The fact that they haven't gone, we'll keep it as a nuisance misdemeanor offense and charge you. Because one of the things I noticed in America, in the legal states, when I drove around and did a road trip in 2018, I believe, actually, there was nowhere to consume cannabis. But if it's a classist thing, it's $100 fine in a hotel for smoking tobacco, or it's a $250 fine for smoking cannabis in the hotel. So you just, if you're wealthy, that's where you smoke cannabis. You just go to your hotel, you smoke weed in your hotel, and as you leave, you give them 250 quid for however long you were there, the $250, and that's it. They're not going to ring the police or anything like that. But it's a tax. So therefore, it's classist. It's another one of these mechanisms. And I discovered the interpretation by some of the regions in California, because obviously in America, you've not just got federal. I'm not explaining this to you, by the way. I'm explaining this to the listeners, you guys out there. That might not know this. You've got federal, you've got state, then you've got sort of jurisdictions within that, townships, and then you've got independent sheriff forces and all sorts, and they can veto and change and update laws. And so some of those places interpreted the only consuming cannabis in your own home meant to be an owner of a home. So if you don't own your home, if you rent it, you can't smoke cannabis in it. Therefore, you can get raided for smoking cannabis in your own home. So there's still these most pernicious aspects of prohibition, which is, as you alluded to perfectly, it's social control. It is about engineering the outcomes of individuals' lives. And obviously these drugs are dangerous because, people get a bit radical, they might eat a mushroom and all of a sudden go, well, I don't want to work at Tesco anymore. Do you know what I mean? And oh God, the whole system collapses. I can understand why they're quite scared of us and doing it. It's interesting.
But you make a good point about the tentacles of prohibition, like around housing law, because again, this is where we work. So, just going back to kind of different legal frameworks and the introduction of medicinal cannabis in the UK, and all the limitations that we have seen subject to or post the 2018 change in law, and the fact that on the ground not much has changed. But the private clinics, obviously through the Drug Science Project, has seen a significant increase of people who are legally prescribed cannabis. And we've started to see lots of problems pop up around people's legal rights, so people who are in social housing being told that that's a Section 8 offence, so they might get evicted, and then having to explain and put in arguments to their landlords that actually this is a prescribed medication, and they're like, but it's still cannabis, because the law itself hasn't, so and driving, all of those things, like just where we've had cases of people who've lost their jobs, they were with agencies, and because they were using cannabis as a medicine, the contractors wouldn't keep them on, they had no employment rights. So all of these different things that prohibition and cannabis prohibition has kind of seeded itself in will need to be unpicked. So it's not just about the criminal framework, it's about what areas of our lives has this pervaded, and how do we make sure that we're pulling it out of those areas as well.
Exactly, and all of those areas should be the things that are first addressed before day one of commercial sale of any drug. I often think of I go to the analogy, and some people say it's a bit extreme, but from the LGBTQ plus members, the people that identify as members of that community, including activists that I've spoken to, they agree with the analogy that it's the nothing about us without us.
Yeah.
So it just feels like legalization in the first instance in a lot of spaces was just, oh, I've discovered cannabis, this new thing, and it's wonderful, and I want the law changed for me, and it's fine. Ignoring the legacy of the suffering, of the misery, people that physically gave their lives, that championed for decades in the face of oppression, that were hung, that were shot, that were buried for the fucking plant, for the privilege. That must first be honored and respected, and as you said, to be baked into any legislative movement forward. And anything that doesn't do that is a rejection, is a repudiation of everything that these people have suffered for. And I think that's repugnant to me. That's repulsive. That I'm revulsed by the idea of that. And that's one of the reasons why legalization has become almost, to use the parlance of our time, a trigger to me. I hear it and it's a buzzword, and I'm going, it's a dog whistle. You're saying me and the rich boys and all the chads are going to get wealthy, but the guys that have been growing it for years, that have made oil and FECO, that have arguably, allegedly, I suppose I have to say, because of the Cancer Act, kept children alive, that have dealt with tumors, that have, you know, put things into reverse for all kinds of conditions and ailments. And now there's this co-option again by the pharmaceutical system predominantly to then go, we've just discovered this magical plant and we want this law that's going to, and it's no, we fucking did this. You have to honor what has been, and there has to be this open transparency. There will be an opportunity to make money, to float it on the stock market, to do whatever. But we have to ensure that the reasons that we're changing this now is for social equity, is for justice, is for fairness and equality. That if you then go, well, now we're going to let these guys get rich, you're going to create this warped system. We're in a point of, frankly, cannibalistic capitalism, or some describe it late stage capitalism. It's eating itself.
Yeah.
And if we give that now, these plants and these medicines, whether you like it or not, I mean, fuck, some people are using PCP medicinally. Argue with me, come fight me.
Yeah,
but
totally.
that's the way it is. It doesn't, you cannot equate to, well, that has no medicinal benefit. If it is improving the mental state, the physical state of that individual for what they're doing, and it's in some way giving them a small benefit, even if it's just keeping them alive to go to the next fucking day, that's their antidepressant. And that's, we have to recognize those things rather than going, oh, well, mushrooms can be beneficial if you come to our clinic and you're allowed only 100 milligrams and you have to eat this first and then sleep here and we can't let you go until 6 o'clock and all of no, all of this is individual. And that, again, you can create these legal systems of consumption, of access, but without recognizing the individual way that some people are going to use it. Like, look at the clinic system now. Leafy released a study, commented on a study saying 90% of prescribed cannabis consumers here in the UK want to combust or still combust their medicine. Yet the law says it nullifies your prescription, and according to new Care Quality Commission guidelines, you will have your prescription removed if you admit to combustion.
Wow. I didn't know about can you share that with me? The guidelines?
Yeah, we'll have maybe press for time, but let's have a conversation about
but I couldn't agree with you more. And what I would say, like, if it makes you feel any better in the kind of, you know, we're only small organizations, but it is something that I think all of the organizations who work in this space are keenly aware of. Like, none of us are talking about legalization for legalization's sake. I think everybody is very much on the same page that we need to make sure that the fundamentals are achieved. And I think this comes back to your earlier point about the different drugs and regulation around other substances. And the experience of cannabis regulation in the US, I think it's given us a really good grounding of kind of thinking about how do we achieve this. And then, you know, one of the big challenges that we have in the UK compared to the US is the lack of a movement around this, you know, and that's not just the folks who are part of the cannabis movement, but it's also people within racial justice movements, because this is a racial justice issue. I mean, when you are seeing, you know, Black people stopped and searched at nearly 9 times the rate of white people, largely for cannabis, then, you know, that disproportionately impacts their community. And what happened in the US is there is a huge recognition within organizations like the NAACP that, you know, drug laws are a tool of oppression. They are part of the tools of structural racism. And so that's allowed for this kind of mass movement behind it, which we don't have in the UK, but which we are trying to contribute to building, you know, she says with her white face, but we work very closely with organizations that are led by Black people and who are entering this space in a way like Unjust UK, Katrina French, like, give their organization a follow. They're doing fantastic work in this space. And really trying to think about how we build that movement that goes back and sort of standardize, it says that sets those red lines that I mentioned earlier, like, this is how we see this working. And that can stand up to industry and all of the resources industry have, or get industry to also back those red lines. You know, they claim to care about the corporate social responsibility side of things. So, you know, get them to back it. I'm probably more aligned with you and think that's highly unlikely to happen. But nonetheless, you know, that's what we need to do. But that conversation's happening in the cannabis space. It's not happening with the other drugs. And we're seeing how quickly the psychedelic space is moving to a medicalized, commercialized model across the globe. and the absence of kind of movements, so racial justice movements, and then particularly like the indigenous populations, who these are their drugs culturally, spiritually, and how excluded they are from these conversations, that it is predominantly a very white, very affluent, very male movement. And any criticism of the movement leads to people being excluded. So, I think many of your listeners will be aware of some of the concerns that have come out about the psychedelic use of psychedelic in medical settings and as a therapeutic tool, and some of the concerns and journalists in Canada had written about this. I can't remember their name now. It's Symposium, who write really thoughtfully about this area of work. Really good guys, and they were apparently at a conference recently in Florida. Very high-end conference, expensive to get into, but they were actively excluded because they've been critical, and that concerns me, that the space is not open to criticism, and also it hasn't got that level of activism that's saying this is how we should legalize these drugs, largely because the advocates for legalization themselves come from the population who will benefit from it. So that, again, is, I think, a really worrying development. And, in terms of the other drugs, it's great to see Colombia exploring the idea of regulating cocaine, but how far along? And I think Colombia, based on the political leadership at the minute, will work with the cocaleros on the ground around that. And the unionization of the farmers in those regions is a really positive influence. And I think, in the UK, one of the things we want to do is really work with colleagues as allies around, how do we unionize people who use drugs? The representation of people who use drugs as a unionized, powerful body that can influence change is not that, sort of stupid an idea. It exists in Australia. Sweden, for all its awfulness, the Swedish government actually funds the Swedish drug users. And it's an awful system there. But, there is voices being supported to influence policy, and that doesn't exist here, and that's really bad.
This is something I've been pitching for a while. CCU is the rough kind of terming of the Cannabis Consumers Union. Yeah. And it's exactly this. We have trade bodies, we have entities for the industry and the business, but what about the fucking people? This is, again, the thing of it is the actual human beings. And you're speaking beautifully, eloquently there of the indigenous populations of exactly that. We know about the psychedelic mushrooms. Yeah, we have kind of our own culture of pagan history here in the UK of liberty caps, for example, or is it waxy? I can't remember what the hell you call them. We've got I think 7 or 8.
Amanita.
We've got Amanita as well, which is, I suppose, more of a dissociant than it is sort of a classical psychedelic. But I think we have 7 or 8 different indigenous or invasive that have been here long enough to kind of become native species of psychotropic mushrooms. But it's interesting what you're seeing with the boys club, as you were speaking of before, is that it seems to me the majority of money is the same guys that pumped and dumped the cannabis industry, as we saw in 2018 with Canada with its stock market. We've seen with what happened with GW and its stock price and its eventual sale to Jazz, etc. But they're looking at patenting synthetic analogs and isomers. They're not going, we want the therapy with naturally occurring psilocybin, which we then convert into psilocin. They're looking for synthetic psilocin, or they'll just make an isomer, and so it's mirrored, and it does loosely the same sort of thing. Now, as me and Dennis McKenna spoke of in a previous podcast, they're trying to create the high without the high, and they're missing the point. The what used to be called ego death, what we now, I suppose, term dissolution of the default mode network, that separation of self from self and identity and the oneness feeling, that is as powerful as anything else that you will face in your journey of your air quotes bad trip, of your wonderful experience, whatever it may be. That integration that occurs after the fact, it's the initial separation from self that allows the healing. You're pausing, and if you're living in an environment of continuous trauma, as we all are under certain socioeconomic policies designed, I'm not going to get too political here, but about 15 years into the collapse of our economy, you know what I mean? The dissolution of services, the breakdown of communities, of interpersonal relationships, partly due to technology and other factors. But then drugs bind us and bring us back together in that way. And it shouldn't be the goal, well, you guys at a festival and we see you in K-holes and your dirty scruffies and whatever else and get dragged off by security and beaten and robbed and assaulted and all sorts happening to them. But if you give $6,000 to, I'm not going to name you because you might get me in trouble, and I am talking to your legal department at the minute, and a company in this country, for $6,000 you can get ketamine infusion. Yeah, and you're a patient, and then if you were to be pulled over and had ketamine in your system, oh no, you're a patient, it's fine. But if you were to be found with a crumb of ketamine in some of the jurisdictions in this country, they are so hateful toward that substance because they do not understand the community and the people that use it. It is an unbelievably powerful antidepressant. And if you cannot get your head around why people would do that.
You're absolutely right. We've actually had helpline calls because, as I said, we run a helpline. So, I mean, this is one of the joys of the policy work that I do. It's actually based on real life experience from the folks who use drugs and are affected by the laws, or who are scared of the laws. Not that it deters use, but just, what happens.
Consequence.
Yeah. And we've had calls from people who are managing really serious depression and bipolar disorder through their ketamine use and say that nothing else has worked. And the fact that we're constantly pushing people into that fear of criminalization, as well as having to cope with their medication in a kind of like illicit market setting, is just really cruel. I mean, it's so cruel. And I totally agree with you around the kind of the corporatization of this. But also, like I spent, what was it, in 2016, I did some psychedelic sitting at the Boom Festival. So like Europe's Burning Man, which is all about the psychedelics. And I remember, and it again goes back to your kind of point about exceptionalism. I remember, guy who'd been using psychedelics for decades. He was in his 60s. He's like, but you have to understand, our drugs are different. They're plants. And I'm like, oh wow, every single one of them really are plant-based. And I think what's really important, and this comes back to this idea of movement building, is with the cannabis movement, it's like, the silos actually cause problems, and if we started to kind of watch each other's back across, I think people use a myriad of drugs. I don't think anyone uses one single drug, it's usually a combination. But often people will sort of identify with a drug more than another drug.
Or they'll feel more comfortable saying and being associated to that drug,
Yeah. But I think actually we could achieve a lot more if we came together and recognized that we were just harmed by the drug laws, regardless of whether you're a cannabis user or a heroin user. And again, red lines, decrim for everybody immediately. Cannabis regulation, we're further along with. That conversation is about how we do it, but how we do it to influence the markets that will follow, and to support those markets to follow. And like a much more kind of, like I've said this repeatedly over the 2 decades that I've worked in this movement, like the siloing of user movements really frustrates me. And also kind of the stigmatization of people who use drugs like heroin and crack cocaine, which are often really rational responses to experiences that they've gone through in life. They're using it in a medicinal way as well. And for lots of people, they're using recreationally, and we don't have a conversation about people who are using heroin and crack cocaine recreationally, and they probably make up 70 to 80% of the market.
That is the thing of it when you really drill into it, is most people that are there with their couple of lines of sniff and their beer and their cigarettes on the Friday night, and then looking at the heroin user and going, every heroin user is an addict. We know they're not. It doesn't matter. And there's this just inability. I understand cognitive dissonance and biases and the way it works psychologically, but it's still deeply frustrating to watch people. I mean, it's the same like you say with Westminster. I think it's still 12 subsidized spots inside that Parliament complex where they can get alcohol. You know what I mean? In the past, 10 years, the Sun and other newspapers have found methamphetamine, they found cocaine, they've found all sorts in the Home Office and in the Houses of Parliament. They found coke in Boris Johnson, the toilet opposite Boris Johnson's office.
And wasn't it Chevening House recently?
Yeah, and it's basically everywhere they look, and it's just one of these things of just rampant hypocrisy. They go, no, we're the good ones. Anyone that struggles with it, they're the bad one. And it's then, okay, that means the drug isn't addictive in and of itself. That means it's not this one thing you touch and everybody's life is ruined, like you say. If it means you're not a special person that went, well, I sniffed some cocaine and I'm not going to go rob a granny. that means it's not how it works. It means the person that then needs that is clearly in such a point of desperation that they would even consider that.
And prohibition is why we see acquisitive crime associated with their drug use and poverty. Yeah. It's the structural issues around it.
Yeah.
And it comes back to the point you said, nothing with us without us. Who is the us? You know, the us should be everybody who's negatively impacted by prohibition and by socioeconomic, and aligning themselves with the recognition that things are made worse by socioeconomic policies that result in people having to use drugs as a way of managing. There's positives of drug use. I would always say that there is pleasure with drug use, but there is also a rational response to using drugs to cope with just this. You know, as you said, you know, the failing economic policies that benefit the few at the expense of the many. You know, the fact that housing isn't a statutory right for all, the fact that there isn't universal benefits for all, you know, like, you know, I mean, a universal income for all. You mean, like, the fact that, you know, climate change is on our door. Drug use is actually a rational response to all of that. And the more that we start to frame it in that way and come together as a movement, I think the more that we'll achieve.
Yeah, we need each other's backs, especially post-COVID, man. It was completely, as you said, a normal response to just, I don't drink, I give up drinking, but I picked up drink, you know, I'll happily admit, you know, I popped a couple of diazepam. I had moments where I just needed to just not be what I was dealing with. And I've recently been diagnosed with ADHD. I'm waiting to be assessed for autism. And when you start to look at this and you go, okay, who are the problematic users? If we then say this, like, if you look at Global Drug Survey, which I know yourself work as part of one of their boards, the basic abstraction of that, if you then take the World Health Organization's data as well, is somewhere between 10 and, as you say, about 30% of any drug population will suffer dependency issues of some various degree on a spectrum of various harms. But you can then be in both the 30 and the 70 in a weekend.
Totally.
It's not, you're not stamped with it and you're stuck with it. Obviously, some drugs, as we say, vary, or polydrug use can be quite problematic. We're seeing obviously big problems with cocaethylene. So cocaine now, we saw for a while, it works really well for neurodivergence. People that would use amphetamine as well as the budget man's cocaine. I did myself. I had a massive problem with amphetamine because I said I was re-diagnosed with ADHD recently because as a child, I don't remember this, was diagnosed when I was about 7. And when I was about 9, I tried to off myself by taking on my Ritalin. And then they kind of very quickly went, we're not going to give the kid drugs anymore, sort of thing. And we backed away from that sort of thing. But then I found as a young adult, amphetamine, a couple of a gram to 2 grams a day of really cheap base I could live. But I couldn't then sleep. It was the consequence of it. I'd then have to medicate with other substances. But during the day, my brain functioned one thought after another, and I was able to operate. And that's no different than people having 4 or 5 coffees from Starbucks during the day, or going out for 6 or 7 cigarettes, or then coming home and popping the wine at the end of the day. That 30%, as we were saying, majority of them, it's mental health. That if we had really good trauma services, if we didn't have the social stigma, the ability to walk down the street and a person to feel self-righteous and going, to a homeless person, somebody using drugs, scoring drugs, trying to get that pound, and you condescend.
Which is a rational response to the trauma of street homelessness.
Exactly. You take a drug that then reduces your thermal regulation. You can't feel it's cold. You know, you take something that makes you less embarrassed to beg for the money, that gives you the thing that makes you feel a human for a moment, that gives you dignity in yourself, that gives you connection to your soul. You know what I mean? I can't understand these self-righteous motherfuckers, these people. I'd give them money, but they'll only spend it on drugs. I'm like, what the fuck would you? So I'm getting animated there, but what would you do if you were in that position? You'd lie and go, yeah, I'll buy a sandwich, honestly. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You know? Yeah, they'll still take the food. Just give them food and the fucking money if you can, or at least give them eye contact. It's the main thing I want to say to anybody, because I've been in this fucking position. Just give them fucking eye contact. They're human beings. Acknowledge what they are. Even if you can just say, good morning, mate. You all right? You don't have to engage in a full conversation. You just, for a moment, acknowledge that they matter. That is enough. That is enough.
We run legal services out of a number of the homeless centres in London. And the one thing that we are fundamental about is treating our clients with dignity, absolute dignity, like meeting them where they're at, making sure they get their benefits. And it's so interesting. Some of the workers, I won't name the organizations, and this tends to be more the drug treatment services, to be fair. Some of the workers are like, why are you getting them their benefits? They're just going to spend it on drugs. And I'm like, it's their legal right. you mean they have a legal right to be on a specific benefit. If they haven't been placed on that, they have a legal right to challenge that decision and to get back data pay. And the response of like, but they'll spend it on drugs. I'm like, at least they'll be safe around, knowing where there's income coming from, knowing that they will be able to buy food and drugs or just buy drugs. That's up to them. I get very distressed at the idea that the drugs are the problem. That is one of the things, again, we say in the organization all the time is like drug policy often is not about the drugs. It's about
it's human rights.
Yeah, exactly. And actually it is about my right to use a drug safely without the interference of the state, and safely should mean actually a regulated market, but also a market that is a fair market that provides equitable solutions. But also, it is about housing, it is about income, all those things I've already mentioned. And that complexity is sometimes really hard for us to express as an organization, that like the solutions that we see aren't simply legalization, aren't simply decriminalization. These policies are important, but how these policies are implemented is fundamental. And then these policies need to align with social and economic policies that create a fairer and a better society as well. But that's quite a lot, and it's quite ambitious. But it is something that we really do fundamentally work towards and believe in and care about, like, deeply. And just that's I totally align. When you say the anger that you feel when people look at folks in really distressing situations like street homelessness and judge and put moral value on them, and I always think, therefore, but for the grace of God, not that I'm religious, but any of us can end up in those situations, and we're all human beings, and the most important thing is to respect and be kind to each other.
And that isn't requisite on understanding. I have an expression that I say that if I was born you, raised you, thought as you, I'd live as you. Therefore, I can't question you. Do you know what I mean? It's an oddity, and it's difficult, and you have to constantly keep yourself in check. But it is, you don't need to understand somebody's decision to know they have a legal right to make it. One of the analogies that I draw from this is, think of obesity. The same argument could be made. They are doing something that's harmful. They are to excess of something. Yet we go, okay, we will offer you support, but it is not contingent on anything. There is no legal requirement. You are not denied housing, because I think I brought this up last week, actually, with Sarah, of saying that the landlord can't say, I think that you're too big and you'll break my fixtures or you'll fall through my ceiling. You'd sue the living shit out of that person. They're not allowed to make that assumption. That person is over 18. If you want to go to Krispy Kreme and kill yourself in 5 years with diabetes and heart disease and cholesterol levels or whatever, you're allowed to do that. And so if it wasn't for this thing of the legality, and that legality is twinned with this full morality, so people can then go, well, my alcohol's legal, so I can drink 10 pints, beat my bitch, crash my car, kick the shit out of that guy on the street, and there's nothing that's wrong with that because it's legal. And it's this horrible thing, again, of that cognitive dissonance that, sorry about that language, for that was me impersonating, obviously, that average lout, as it were, or at least the caricature of one. But the point still stands. The same with tobacco consumers or whatever. But we look at sugar. Sugar is the first drug we get kids addicted to. Haribo is the biggest dealer out there, if we want to call them a supplier. And we trick the kid and go, if you stop screaming for 10 minutes, I'll give you this tiny bag of sweets made out of crushed animal bones and waste
create
products.
Award systems based on substances.
and then we wonder why these kids grew up. And it's, again, the lie of schooling. The reason most people are polydrug users is they try one drug and go, well, that wasn't what they said in school or the newspaper says. That didn't kill me. It made me feel euphoric, amazing. I feel alive. I feel confident. I feel empowered. I want to try everything. That's a rational response to that kind of thing. If you're told this one pill will kill you, you'll drink 4 gallons of water, inflate and die from sodium poisoning, or you'll jump off a building or whatever, and you have the best night of your life, of course you're going to want to inquire about other substances. And it's, again, this honesty. And if we had that drug consumers union that was built off lived and living experience, not just those that are accepted. And I think of beautiful people like George Charlton that are kind of allowed to be kind of where they are in some ways because of their sobriety, that their story and narrative is equally as valid if they were still a current drug user.
Totally.
But because they're sober, they're acceptable in the society for that narrative. And I love that he just goes in and goes, oh, drugs are mint.
Yeah.
Obviously not quite as brutal as that. I'll have references episode below so people
Yeah,
can
no.
understand that.
George is a good friend. Yeah.
But
Agree
yeah,
with you totally.
and that's what we need, is that brutal, raw vulnerability and honesty to understand that I hate seeing these trends now of, say, like ADHD or autism on TikTok or whatever, and somebody goes, if you're this and this, that's autism. And it's your pigeonholing. And it's no, you allow everyone to manifest to what that means and be protected because they are that, not defined because you want them to be in that box because of that label. And that is,
and I think one of the challenges we have is the fact that we're up against 100 years propaganda war, you know, where you've had governments doing, you know, repeated disinformation campaigns around the harms of these drugs. And we constantly talk about drugs in harms. Like, again, it's very easy to get into that track. And I think that we sometimes at Release can get into that track as well, not least because we're dealing with the helpline calls. And it's not the harms of drugs, it's the harms of drug policy. So you tend to go into quite a negative space sometimes rather than a positive space. But I think we need to constantly remind ourselves and constantly call out this propaganda war, you know, and it's a well-funded one. Like, you know, you'll get people like the Peter Hitchens of this world, you know, the well-funded global cannabis conspiracy, you know, Soros funded, you know, and we are Soros funded. And I am very proud to take Open Society Foundation money. They fund drug policy reform, they fund racial justice, they fund sex workers' rights, they fund trans rights. You know, if that's an organization that I'm aligned to, I am very proud of that. They fund human rights. But they talk about this like well-funded. It's like, oh my God, we're up against government budgets. I mean, 1.6 billion a year is spent in drug law enforcement. You know, this is what we're talking about. I mean, we're not well-funded in any ways. So I think constantly calling out that propaganda war, and then, as you say, bringing people with living experience into the space, not just lived experience, that is important and it's valid. And people like George, who we work with, does great work. But also, you know, I've got a client who they were threatened with having their diamorphine medication removed. So we've got a handful of people across the UK who still are on take-home diamorphine, so the old British system.
Yeah.
And there was a group in one part of the country whose treatment provider was going to actually take away all prescribing of diamorphine. So 4 of them came to us, told us about it, and it was a financial and policy decision. So we issued judicial review proceedings against the provider. We got an interim judgment to allow the patients to retain their medication. And we finally got the outcome of it was an independent expert determined that they should stay on their medications. So that was great. So we won the case, albeit we didn't get a judicial review ruling, but we got it settled in their favor. But one of our, you know, they're all brilliant. They're all managing their lives and they all talk about their medication just helping them feel normal. That's it. This is not about getting high. It's just feeling normal. And one of them is a wonderful human being who is in their 60s and who works in a care home, worked through the care home throughout COVID, was a COVID hero, you know, and they're still scared to tell their story, understandably, because of the stigma. But those are the kind of people that represent a very large group of folks who use drugs, and the stereotypes are constantly dismissed and challenged when you get more people with living experience in the space. And I think that's really important for us to do, because I think that then is a way of fighting against, you know, countering those propaganda messages that have been seeded within the general public. You know, not least, you know, I was at a meeting today where people were talking about drug use, and they were talking about being respectable citizens. And I was like, oh my God, you think drug use is disrespectable? You know, whatever. You know, I was like, Steve Jobs, you know, like the numbers of places it's provided inspiration for things. Whether those are good things or bad things is another conversation. But, you know, the idea that you can't be a respectable citizen because you use drugs just was a nonsense to me. But I also understood that this person didn't work in the drugs field, didn't work with people who use drugs, and had been kind of fed the decades of prohibition nonsense. And it's a challenge to break that down. But it's really important we do, because that then feeds into the type of policies we'll end up with through reform.
Very true. Very true. This leads into quite a good conversation I wanted to have with you about this. Some people feel, I've often maybe criticized, felt that not necessarily called out because I can't identify, but feel that there is some elements of controlled opposition within some drug reform groups. This isn't to try and oust yourself or any of your colleagues or anything. What I mean by this is entities that they haven't quite got there. That for whatever reason they are doing enough by 20 years ago standard, 30 years ago standard, but are not getting more progressively more radical. They're not progressively getting, okay, so if America's selling it and now more than 50% of the population can, air quotes, legally buy cannabis, we need to really push with shit. All right, Germany's getting on board in 2024. You got Luxembourg, you got Switzerland, you got there's no acceleration within the established organizations. And as we sort of alluded to when you and I had a conversation prior to recording, a lot of the grassroots entities were either astroturfed by big industry and investment into creating the 2018 law change here in the UK, or were just attacked, destroyed, silenced through different means and ways. And a lot of this was misinformation and similar sort of tactics that we've seen of propaganda, etc. But we're at a point now where, as we say, if we get this union together and we have this kind of push, how are we really sort of, are we capable of really getting any reform? I'm busy dancing around here, 2019, and you're blocking from the ACMD. There's an organization, they frustrate me to a certain lesser degree, because obviously it's supposed to be independent. How independent it is in actuality and practicality is debatable, discussable potentially. I understand avoidable if you want it to be. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to get your opinion on if we create this new groundswell, do we have anywhere to go? Like, can we actually, get beyond the Conservative drug policy group or the Labour group or some Lib Dems and a few Greens, whatever? Is there an entity within the government that is forced to take us seriously? Obviously, we don't have constitutional rights because we don't have a constitution. So we don't have the same things to fall back on as America did. They just got enough people together and the system allowed them to have their voices heard. Do we have an apparatus or anything to do so? And if not, is that because of an intentional roadblock, or is that just an oversight?
I mean, great question. And I think there's a number of ways we can come. I think it's the type of reform that we're talking about. So, like when we talk about cannabis regulation, I constantly have said, and I probably need to extend this timeline, but I think probably in the next 5 years we will start to see serious moves towards what cannabis regulation will look like in this country. And in terms of if we want to call it the user voice experience in that, I mean, what we would be advocating for is very much ensuring that that whole policy apparatus has that influence throughout it, so that, when you have government making that policy, that there is representation from the cannabis social club ecosystem as it stands now, and hopefully where it will be in the future, with folks like yourself and others who have been historically pushing for models of reform that include the social club model. So the apparatus doesn't exist. I think it doesn't. I think the only area that we might see it starting to come back together is around people who are in treatment, and that idea of nothing with us without us. Nothing without us with us. But that idea of influencing treatment in a way that makes sure that it is more respectful of people's rights within treatment programs. And this is treatment for obviously heroin and mainly heroin dependency, because we don't have any other real medications for anything else. But also around, so influencing local treatment settings, influencing local funding, and influencing national policy. And I think we're starting to see through the Black Review and things like that, a greater recognition by policymakers at national level and at a local level of the need to have that voice within the system, because at the minute the absence of that voice is leading to poor quality treatment in many areas, people not wanting to be in those treatment settings because of punitive actions that are taken by prescribers and others who work in them. That's not to say all are like that, but some are. And that it's not attractive. It's not attractive if you have to go in and pick up a medication every single day and be supervised whilst you swallow that medication, because you can't be trusted to take it home. So I think in that we'll start to see models of influence, and then that allows us to bring it out further, say, to when we get to that stage of influencing what cannabis policy would look like. Like, we would be advocating, and this is in our paper about regulation, is that all decision-making bodies that are involved in that regulatory process should include people who are involved in all parts of the market, particularly those who are involved in the social clubs. Like, that's what I think we've explicitly said that in the paper. But to understand what the policy at a national level should look like, at a local level, we'll need licensing boards. Mm-hmm. So, you know, someone who comes from that background should be part of that licensing board. I also think, you know, even at least because currently licensing boards operate out of local councils. So at the very least, there should be like an external reference group that's advising that licensing board, unless people want to become councillors. So all of that kind of framework, thinking about where decisions are made and how do we influence decisions and how do we get voices of people who use drugs or have experience of those specific markets within those decision-making processes. It's an uphill battle because it was really decimated as part of the recovery agenda back in 2010, when we saw the move away from harm reduction, especially around heroin treatment, into recovery. And there was a load of really great service user or user voice organizations who were just decimated. But I think in light of the really high drug-related deaths we have in this country, and in particular in Scotland and the work that's being done in Scotland, but it's not just isolated to Scotland. The northeast of the country and the northwest have particularly high rates as well. They're not that far behind Scotland, and we have to remember that. But I think that experience is, you know, resulting in politicians, commissioners, drug treatment services going, shit, this is happening under our watch and we need to fix it. And actually, it's the people who use our services, it's the people who use these drugs, heroin, who understand what we need to do, and we're not listening to them, and we need to listen to them. So I think there's changes afoot. Will the ACMD ever change? I mean, to be fair, I think it's reason. Independent and radical are two different things, aren't they? So that's what.
Unfortunately, in this context, yes, I suppose very, very different, yeah.
And it's an advisory body. So, like, even when you did have people who were radical on it, and you did, you know, so you had people who were pushing for reforms, academics who got things like reports saying people shouldn't be criminalized for possession of drugs, supporting drug consumption rooms, like the work Alex Stevens did on the overdose situation in the opiate report for the ACMD explicitly called for drug consumption rooms. So you mean, even where they could do that, the lack of bite that the ACMD has, because the legislation doesn't allow them to have that, means that ultimately the people we have to influence are the politicians, because they are the ones that hold the legislative control of this. Okay,
so what I'm hearing here is let's go off some loose estimates before I'm annoyed. I don't really trust the sources of potentially some of these statistics, but let's say loosely there's 1.8 million people that are self-medicating with cannabis consumption. Let's chuck in another million of, well, you could probably chuck in 3/4 of the population if they've had 3 pints on a Friday and their mate's got a key of it. But yeah, we can chuck in a couple of million for cocaine. If you then want to put in recreational cannabis, so-called recreational cannabis consumers, we can take the percentage of the population to very high. If we got all drug consumers together and we became a political party, we just become the government.
Or even well, that could be a plan, Simpa.
But if not, if we've got 100,000 people that literally, if we can through a union voice, then go, we will vote for the party that fucking represents our needs. They've kept us so fractured and disillusioned from each other that, yeah, you've got people with the fat blunt going, yeah, dirty smackheads, crackheads, and it breaks my fucking heart. It's so painful. No, you see people drinking alcohol or taking the sugar or eating fatty foods. Do you know what I mean? It's all the same goddamn things. The difference is the legality, the moral acceptability, and I suppose whatever the Overton window of acceptability of drug use would be, is that currently at this part in our history, that's where it's shifted. And it's going to continue to shift. Look at the trend. Look at Gen Z, the Zoomers and that. They're like 25%, 30% teetotal. They just don't want to touch alcohol. You know, the majority of them don't smoke tobacco. They've got a little bit of a problem with nicotine consumption through vaporizers, which I'm sure we'll figure out in 10, 15 years. But then other drugs, they're far more likely to research the drugs that they're taking. They're far more likely to research the contraindications and interactions between these substances. And so they're creating a much more informed space to use drugs, still growing up in the same sort of system. And I just think that if we can have their grasp of technology, if we can then have the grit and determination of the generation of, I'm trying to get this right, Gen X, I suppose, that kind of started the reform movements in Western Europe, and then the millennials that are caught up in the middle, all together, that is that is the majority of the population now. It's just against then, I suppose, your prohibitionist boomers and your prohibitionist people in amongst those other generations.
Our Xers are not doing well either.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. I mean, like that FT study that was out, the Financial Times study that was out, that said that the millennials are your group that are less likely to turn more conservative as they get older.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. Like, I think there's, like, I mean, I hope it was one of the Gen Xers that didn't turn toward conservative and got more radicalized as she got older. You mean, I think it's interesting. I think politics is going to be up against it in the next 10 or 15 years, and that will all align. Like, I think the debate that we're having about how we do it right now is not necessarily the debate that we need to be having. Do you know what I mean? It's the debate about what we have when, you know, the more conservative amongst the population are no longer with us. But that changes things, you know, and how do we maybe think about how we're gaming that system out and planning it? But you mean, at the very least, some of the foundational stuff needs to start to be embedded. And I think the idea of unions is really important at the minute. We've seen how important that is around the kind of, as you say, you know, late stage capitalism and the problems that have occurred and people demanding to be paid properly and treated properly within their employment. The fact that we're going to have more technology changing how the employment scene works as well is part of the conversation. But the idea of unionization, and it's not just like, as I said, there are countries around the world where this happens. Like I've mentioned Sweden, and there's problems there, obviously, because of the lack of influence. But in Australia, the Australian drug users movement is fundamental to all decision-making processes. They have a seat at the table. You know, when Norway did the review of drug policies, they had an expert body to review whether to decrim or not. And they did recommend decrim, but the politicians didn't pick it up. But on that body were people who use drugs. You know, that's how much that's recognized in other countries. In the US, that is a major part of the movement there. You mean in Oregon, the ballot initiative that won in 2022, 1 years folding in. When was the election? 2020?
It was November 22.
2020.
Which one are we? Is this the psychedelic decriminalization?
Biden. No, it's the decrim initiative in Oregon.
Oh, all drug decrim. Yeah, that was the same Biden, 2020.
Yeah, 2020. So it was, God, that feels like yesterday. But Oregon, I mean, they, on that ballot initiative, not only did decriminalization and probably did one of the best forms in the sense that it's a fine on paper, but if you agree to ring the helpline, the fine gets waived and you just have to ring a helpline. So like, I feel like that's probably as light touch as you can go on a ballot initiative. But they also really cleverly used all the cannabis taxation to fund housing, health, you know, social safety nets within the state. So, you know, again, and that was driven by drug user movements, you know, amazing people like Haven Wheelock and Morgan, who I can't remember Morgan's last name, but just these amazing human beings who are advocating for policies that are founded in principles of abolition, in principles of economic equality, you know, and making sure that people are looked after. Like, I think there's so much rich learning from other places for us, and that we just need to get on and do it and think about it. And Release can't do that because we're not a drug user organization, but we can be allies in that space and work with others to do that.
Yeah,
and we are.
Yeah, well, actively, I think that's quite evident by your presence over the past, been how pervasive since what, 67? 67? Is that right? 67? Yeah. So yeah, you guys have been around the block, you know.
We have.
But you've adapted with it, and I feel one of the things I feel is that the quintessential conservative sort of MP in my head that sat there, you know, with this cork ring, sort of trying to go, no, we can't allow drugs, and drugs are bad and ruinous, and they're looking over at America, and as you said, as we said before about the states become more progressive with each model. If they suddenly dip their foot in the water, it's not the 6-inch end anymore, it's the 6 foot. They suddenly can't go, oh, we're going to allow you to have this limited, because there's all the data and the reasons as why that's bullshit. As we said before, we're a good 10 odd years, decade plus into the experiment of corporate legalization, of mass legalization, with most allowances for expungement, home cultivation, gifting economies. And we're seeing it flourishing. All industry is going up, all crime is going down. You're then seeing this progressive movement is now townships themselves rather than states are decriminalizing in various jurisdictions. They're now trying to decriminalize so-called natural psychedelics for then personal sort of treatment. And then the movement towards sort of conversations around sex work reform, because all of these things are again coupled into
the intersectionality.
So obviously this is something that you've wrote about. I know this is not necessarily Release's sort of stance with what it does, but I just wanted to kind of get your opinion on what we're seeing at the minute, because there's odd pockets of movements. Obviously internationally, there's some amazing organizations rallying and have been for a long time, but it seems like the pandemic hit, OnlyFans came and exploded, and the conversation just never happened. The perfect time for us to all just go, well, yeah, what about this? Instead, you see sensationalist articles of some lassie stood in a house she bought with last month's money and saying how much money they can make. And it's basically a backhanded advert. And it's borderline, obviously, in terms of selling of adult services, etc. But we need to have that and that was the quintessential perfect moment. And it felt like we just went, oh, now we're busy.
Yeah. You mean around sex work and
around decriminalization of sex work and figuring out regulation?
We work closely with like the English Collective of Prostitutes and Swarm and the International Network, both of sex workers and people who use drugs. And I think what's really interesting, and you've really picked up on something, like it's people think of sex work, it's stereotypes again. They often go to street survival sex work. And our view, we align ourselves with our partners in the movement as allies and support decriminalization of all sex work, whether it be online or on the street or in premises. But I think we're seeing an increasing movement to online, and that's then getting mixed up with this kind of online harms bill and creating criminal frameworks for what is arguably incredibly safe activity that can be regulated. Like the lack of regulation around age controls, etc., is on the companies that provide the services, not on the workers themselves. And as usual, it's the workers who will be the focus of a lot of the proposals, rather than the folks who are making lots of money. They are obviously a focus, but they can pay their way out of it. As you said, it's the kind of classes, not quite the classes system, but the corporate versus the person who uses it. So I think, it's complex in that sense, but I know, we wrote the Sex Workers and the Law booklet, which is kind of outlines all of the legal issues that people who sex work have to navigate, from, the criminal law through to taxes, through to, immigration issues. And we're just updating that at the minute. It's going to be a big task, and, we need to get a bit of funding for it, because it is such a big task, because we'll need to bring in experts in sort of technology law and the safety bill side of things. But I think one of the things we've recognized is that this change in the market needs to be really reflective in the work that we do around providing people with their rights. But yeah, it's no brainer. It's so interesting though, when you see, because the sex worker movement's amazing. Like they've done such great work at kind of bringing people together and being a voice, and really influencing policy and getting celebrities like Rupert Everett on board doing BBC documentaries about it. But the whole regulation, legalization argument, it's like, no way, We just want decrim and normal labour laws. Thank you very much. Because if we start to go into regulation and legalisation, then we're looking at the risk of capture. And it doesn't have to be corporate capture. It can just be capture that by people who want to exploit us as workers. So it's just that difference in terms of the policy solutions, which shows the complexity of things. I think that's an important thing for us to recognize, is like there is not one answer fits all for responding to prohibition of different activities.
Exactly that. It shows why, again, this my pet peeve with language. If we have obviously legalese, our colloquial language, our dictionary defined language, so legalization with a big L, the branded, the proper noun, of the movement of legalization is this neoliberalistic corporate mouth service of going, oh, you're right, yeah, we shouldn't kick your doors in and lock you in jails for decades. Oh, fine, give us your money, we'll sell you it, but you're only allowed it in this or whatever. And it's whereas then for the sex work, exactly that, there are existing labour laws. There is enough within the existing framework. It's true of drugs. If you actually, we had Daryl Bickler on. I don't know if you know who Daryl Bickler is.
Yeah.
And he makes a beautiful point and always reminds me, drugs are not illegal. The compound,
activities.
It's the activity, exactly that. You cannot criminalize an inanimate object. The inanimate object has no nature, has no desire or drive. Yeah. So then if we look at the Misuse of Drugs Act, 1971, let's kind of park after shitty legislation in the 2001 and 2018 and 2017 novel and all
16,
that. Was it 16? Yeah, it was 16. It was written 16. Was it not signed in 2017? I thought it was
16.
January.
It's a 2016 Act.
Yeah, but so it's 16 even though she signed it in the January of whatever. That's what's confused me. All right. But yeah, let's park them for a second. If you look at it, actually, there is within, as we touched on before, Section 8D and all the rest of it, there is framework within it that it's saying about that if you remove the listed name of it, the placement of it in its category, it fits into the rest of the framework. Obviously, they kept alcohol and tobacco outside of it, but if that was then reformed and actually made to serve its function, it could be a loose sort of framework for commercial activities, which is what we kind of need, a more restricted commercial regulation. But then the average individual, if me and my mates just want to have a shed in the garden and we grow it and hang around with 20, 30 of us, that's no different than having a barbecue on a Friday or going and buying 20 odd crates and doing whatever. That should always be, as we said, decriminalized. But I feel that there needs to be that regulation, not necessarily a limitation, but a realistic control of monopolies, of conglomerates, and obviously the capturing of the market by certain interests, because then by its nature it's finite, and the more they have, the less the people who just want to make 500 quid a month on top of their bills and not miss, they'll pay taxes. They already are. If you're paying tax on their lights, on their nutrients, on their water, on their electric, on the seeds. So there doesn't necessarily then need to be this thing of, oh, you pay as tax for your plants and the commodity of it. If you then sell it, there's self-return tax forms, etc., that can be dealt with. Like I'm saying, the framework is already there, whereas we're being kind of tricked into legalization, big L, the movement being, you people, if you're going to take your drugs, you're not responsible enough to deal with it. We'll tell you exactly what to do, how to do it, and if you don't do it right, we'll criminalize you. And now,
I totally agree that the 71 Act could be amended to allow for frameworks of permissive activities around drugs. I think the reality is, though, that when politicians get to the point that they think that this doesn't work, they'll want to draft new legislation. And that legislation needs to be incorporating all of the things that we've already talked around, expungement of records, decriminalization, anything that potentially allows the tentacles of prohibition to come into it, even within a legal framework. So we give evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee on Drugs earlier in the year, and one of their questions was, is the Misuse of Drugs Act fit for purpose? Well, ultimately, it depends on how politicians want it to work. So currently, the two main parties are supportive of prohibition, so it's not fit for purpose. But it's less about that piece of legislation than what politicians want. And it's our job to try and convince them to take a different tact. So I think that's, we can get into the weeds again, she says, but we can get into the weeds of, what this looks like technically from a legal perspective, but ultimately we get nowhere unless we have that support for reform and making sure that the type of reform that we want, the one that bases itself on social and racial justice principles, is at the core of any drafting, whether that be primary legislation or whether it be secondary regs. It needs to make sure that we have our eyes over all of it, and that'll be a big task for anybody that's involved in this work. Interestingly, with the 2016 Act, it is a piece of crap. And I also, I was really affronted by the lack of outrage at the definition of what becomes a psychoactive substance. The fact that it's how it interacts with our central nervous system will determine whether it falls within the definition of the Act or not. And that to me is Orwellian level of control, But it does decriminalize possession with no punishment. So we do have decriminalization in the UK through the Psychoactive Substances Act, and the police do not have the power to stop you if you are in possession of a psychoactive substance, only if you are in possession with intent to supply. So, it's interesting to me that the kind of to use the term cognitive dissonance that exists within our drug laws that allowed for an act that is so overtly based on principles of decriminalization in a way that we would advocate for it, no punishment, no police powers, for certain drugs, because they didn't want to criminalize kids. I somehow don't think kids are being criminalized by this other 1971 Act. But it's such an interesting kind of divergence at a political level, and one that we use all the time to kind of say, you're doing this already and the sky hasn't fallen in, even though I think that the Psychoactive Substances Act at its core around the definition of what is psychoactive is Orwellian and concerning to me around a rights-based approach. So it's not that I think the Act's good. I think it's an interesting thing to explore the kind of ludicrous thinking at a political level of these pieces of legislation and how they're drafted.
Exactly. And obviously, as we spoke of, I think you alluded to earlier, that basically there is no possession alone. In some way, there is supply. In order for you to gain it, you have to have been supplied it. If you purchase more than you require to sell on to subsidize your usage, you are then supplying, and you are considered to be in the same categorization as the individual you've purchased it from, even though you will most often feel that you are not. And again, that's the hypocrisy of it, and that internalized cognitive dissonance and our biases towards our own innocence, I guess, within the system, and our acceptance that, well, I'm a good drug user and there's other bad drug, and it's not. There are drug users and they can do good or bad things. In the same
like
way
human beings across the world.
Exactly that. So yeah, good point. We've discussed that in private, so we'll leave that there, folks. Sorry about that. But that's personal information that we shouldn't be putting out there. But ultimately, there are these contradictions, these issues within the legislation that, again, I think a consumers union, working closely with allies like yourself within reform movements, within other humanistic movements, we can be very loud, because we all ultimately want the same things. We want the laws to make sense. We want there to be justice, equality, fairness, and a lack of prejudice against us for our identities, our actions, or our associations.
Yes. I agree totally with that. Was that a question?
No, I suppose not really. It was just a succinct way of wrapping up that bit. I'm going to quickly ask you my last question that I ask sort of all guests when I remember. We know what the past 20 years have sort of been, but what does the future hold for you?
So the future. One of the things I am really interested in is, I think post the racial justice uprisings after George Floyd's murder, we saw a greater conversation about abolition. And I am really interested in exploring abolitionist principles through a drug policy framework. And the idea of removing carceral institutions like the police and jail, prisons from behavioral activities like drugs. And I think, that sits with all of the conversation we've had so far today around legalization and models of legalization. But, often when I talk about this, and I am no expert, I am on a journey, I am learning myself, but people were like, well, we need prisons, we need police. And at the very first step, what I would say to that is, every time a politician announces that they're going to increase policing or they're going to build more prisons, they are announcing that they have failed. They have failed to prevent crime. And surely we would want as a society to work towards solutions that prevent crime rather than simply responds to crime, because at that point, bad things have happened potentially. Not always, because not all things should be criminal, like drugs.
Yeah.
So I really want, as an organization and as an individual working on this and having worked on this for 20 years, is really to kind of explore that, to think about how do we use drug policy as a framework to start to build an abolitionist approach within drug policy, but then as an example of how we could do this in other areas of criminal justice reform.
Mm.
Or criminal justice, not reform, criminal justice abolition.
Yeah, and I think it's that cornerstone, it's that key little thing that if we pull it, the whole house of cards falls down.
Yeah,
it's the tool that has been utilized most powerfully by the state around the world, or whatever state that may be, to, as we said, control and coerce conformity amongst its populace. So yeah, once you take away that ability, you suddenly have to rule us legitimately, and if we can suddenly stand up and go, actually, that's wrong, there's accountability. And yeah, I can imagine that's quite intimidating to the certain group of cabal of individuals that are in power at the minute.
Yeah, and it also speaks to ideas of community solutions and communities coming together. And that, like you've talked a lot about disconnection and more connection. So to put it, succinctly, I am really excited about the next few years. I think there's lots of potential for really imaginative work that seeks to advance reform on kind of principles that we would want to see across not just criminal, absence of criminal justice, but also social models and economic models that, using drug policy reform, we can start to think about, a way that the world can operate differently. And it's only one small section. There are other areas of work that I think are important to that around rights-based approach. But yeah, I'm quite excited about it all. I'm hopeful. That's a rare thing. I'm usually a cynic.
Hey, I'm often accused of being a cynic, and I'll admit I'm sat here feeling quite optimistic. So yeah, you're right. A lot has changed, and a lot will continue to change. And I look forward to getting you on in the future over the years to see where we're at and what we're doing. Because this podcast ain't going anywhere. I'm going to keep having these conversations because we're going to have to keep chatting this shit out. Because I think that's the only way we have any progress, really, isn't it? If we have open lines of communication.
Well, thank you so much. I've enjoyed that thoroughly.
Likewise. Well, what I'll do, I'm just going to quickly talk some shit, and then let's have a chat about these other things. So yeah, folks, that was Niamh. I think I got the pronunciation correct that time. There we go. Did I? Yeah.
Perfect.
There we go. Yeah, I'm happy with that then.
Perfect.
Sweet. Take one. We'll take that. If you enjoyed this, folks, actually, no, I'm going to wrap up there. All links below for release for some of the stories and articles that we mentioned. I've made some notes, scribbles, that I'll try and get all of the links below in the description box, folks, so you can keep up to date with sort of everything that we've discussed. And everything that Niamh will be up to in the future release. And yeah, if you really enjoyed this, give us a like, share, and a subscribe. Do check us out on patreon.com/Simpa Life. You can find us on all social media platforms at Simpa Life as well. You've been beautiful. I've been Simpa. We'll be back next week with, I don't know, somebody. You'll enjoy it. It'll be cool. Peace. The other thing is, the start of these things, I never know what I'm going to do. I literally go, yo, how are you doing, folks? I waffle on for 2 minutes and try and segue into introducing you. So yeah, whatever comes out, comes out.